She did not look like someone running for her life. She stood straight, chin lifted, hands folded neatly in her lap over a quill she barely knew how to hold without trembling. The heavy, leather-bound ledger in front of her smelled of cedar and old ink, a smell that belonged to grand estates and important men, not to a woman like her, not to a woman pretending. The room was enormous. Gold-framed paintings watched from the walls. Crystal chandeliers dripped light from the ceiling like frozen rain, and across the polished mahogany table, with cold, pale eyes that had clearly never once softened with mercy, stood Lady Victoria Sterling. She wore lavender silk and pearls. She wore contempt like a second gown. The Confrontation Blackwood Manor study, Victoria. You altered 3 lines in this ledger. Column 4. The household coal expenses. Tell me which maid arrives at a new post, knowing how to read financial ledgers. Which scullery girl even knows what column 4 means? Seraphina, who was not Fina, who was not a maid, who was not safe, did not flinch. She had practiced this. She had rehearsed the blank, hollow expression of a woman with nothing to hide, because it was the only expression available to her now. Seraphina, as Fina, my previous employer, my lady. She ran a tight house. She taught us figures, so we wouldn't be cheated at the market. Victoria's lip curled. She stepped closer, the silk of her gown whispering against the marble floor. The 3 little boys near the door shifted uncomfortably. The youngest one, Toby, gripped the arm of the oldest. Their eyes were wide and serious, as if they already understood, even at 7 years old, that something fragile and important was about to shatter. Victoria, a maid who reads ledgers. A maid whose hands have never scrubbed a pot. A maid whose posture is better than mine. Victoria leaned in close enough that Seraphina could smell her perfumed jasmine and malice. Victoria, who are you, really? And then the doors opened. He did not announce himself. He never needed to. The room simply changed when he entered it, the way a sky changes the second before a storm makes itself known. He was tall, the kind of tall that filled door frames, dark hair, slightly unruly at the edges, a black velvet tailcoat that had been made for him alone. His eyes swept the room in 2 seconds and landed not on Victoria, though she was the one making noise, but on Seraphina. He looked at her, the way you look at a fire you have been watching burn for a long time, waiting to see if it will go out or spread. Julian Thorne, Duke of Blackwood, said nothing. He walked to the desk, stood behind Seraphina's chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and looked across at Lady Victoria with an expression that was perfectly, dangerously calm. Julian, is there a problem, Lady Sterling? Victoria straightened. Her composure snapped back into place with the speed of a woman who had spent her whole life practicing composure. But her voice, when it came, was thinner than before. Victoria, your maid appears to have tampered with the household accounts. My maid has been managing the household accounts because my steward fell ill 4 days ago and someone needed to keep this house running. I asked her to review the ledger. What she corrected was an arithmetic error, not tampering. Victoria opened her mouth. I closed it. The 3 boys near the door exchanged a look. Julian, was there anything else? Lady Sterling, there was not. There never was, when Julian Thorne used that tone. Victoria gathered herself and left. Her silk gown hissed across the marble. The door shut behind her. And then there were just the boys, and the Duke, and Seraphina, who was not a maid, sitting very still in a chair that did not belong to her, in a life that did not belong to her, wondering how much longer she could survive inside this beautiful, dangerous lie. She did not know then that the man standing quietly behind her chair already knew exactly who she was. She did not know that he had known for 11 days. She did not know that he had chosen, deliberately, to say nothing. This is the story of Lady Seraphina Vance, who ran from one arranged life and walked straight into the arms of the man she was always meant to love. And this is the story of Julian Thorne, who had waited, without knowing he was waiting, for a woman brave enough to be completely, recklessly, magnificently herself. It begins 3 weeks before that moment in the study. It begins with a letter, a locked door, and a girl who had run out of choices. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Vance Estate, late October, 1882. Midnight. The house smelled of tobacco and old ambition. It always had. Lady Seraphina Vance had grown up breathing both, learning to move through rooms full of men who spoke over her head about the price of land and the value of bloodlines, as if she were furniture that happened to have opinions. She was 23 years old. She had dark hair she usually wore twisted close to her neck. She had eyes that her mother once called too sharp for a drawing room, and her father had called too sharp for her own good. She had a mind that could cut glass, and she had spent most of her life being told, very politely, to put it away. Tonight, she was putting it to use. She opened the drawer of her writing desk and removed 3 things: a small leather coin purse, a folded letter of recommendation she had forged with considerable care and a not inconsiderable amount of guilt, and a velvet bag containing a silver chain. On the chain hung a ring of her family's signet ring, the small crested seal of House Vance. She did not put it on. She tucked it beneath the collar of her plainest grey dress, against the skin of her collarbone, where no one would think to look. Then she picked up the letter that had been sitting on her desk for 6 days. The letter that had started all of this. It was from her uncle, her guardian since her father's death 2 years ago, and it was written in the neat, bloodless script of a man who had already decided, Lord Aldrich Vance, to his niece, Lady Seraphina. You will present yourself on the 1st of November for formal betrothal to Lord Harwick Stane, Marquis of Dunmore. The settlement has been signed. The matter is resolved. You will wear a blue gown. She had read it 6 times. Each time, the same cold swept through her, not panic, but something older than panic, something that felt like a door being locked from the outside. Lord Harwick Stane was 51 years old. He had buried 2 wives. He had a temper that the servants spoke about in whispers, and a grip on his household so absolute that none of his staff ever stayed more than a season. He had seen Seraphina at a winter function 3 months ago, and he had looked at her the way a man looks at something he intends to acquire. She was not going to marry him. She was not going to let herself become a 3rd name on a list of women whose lives had been folded up neatly and put away. She picked up her small bag, walked to her bedroom door, listened until the house settled into its late-night breathing, the low creak of wood, the distant snoring of the footman on the ground floor, and then she walked out. She did not look back, not once. 3 days later, the registry office, London. She had spent 2 nights at a respectable but unremarkable boarding house near King's Cross, paying in coins and giving her name as Miss Fina Wells. She had washed her own dress in the basin and ironed it flat with the heel of her boot. She had eaten bread and cold butter and told herself it tasted like freedom, which was partially true and mostly uncomfortable. The domestic registry office was on a narrow street behind a bookshop. It smelled of cabbage and paperwork. The woman behind the counter had the broad, assessing eyes of someone who had processed 2,000 women just like this one, and Seraphina had to remind herself to slouch. Registry clerk, experience, Seraphina, 3 years, general household. I have a letter. She slid the forged letter across the counter. The clerk read it without expression, then looked up. Registry clerk, you're well spoken for a maid. Seraphina, my last employer valued that, my lady. She said it reflected well on the household. A beat. The clerk looked back at the letter. Registry clerk, Blackwood Manor is looking for someone immediately. The Duke's steward is ill. They need a general maid capable, quiet, and no fuss. It's a winter post. High paying if you keep your head down and do your work. Duke Thorne runs a strict house. Blackwood Manor. The name meant nothing to her then. She would think about that later, how strange it is, that the places that change your life never announce themselves. Seraphina. I'll take it. Blackwood Manor, November, first week. The manor rose out of the grey morning, like something that had decided, long ago, to be permanent. It was built from dark stone that had absorbed 2 centuries of English weather and emerged looking entirely unbothered. The gardens were bare and formal. The gravel drive was perfectly raked. Seraphina stood at the servants' entrance with her single bag, and what she hoped was the expression of a woman who had done this many times before. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, was a compact, capable woman in her 50s who moved like a woman who had never wasted a single motion in her life. She looked Seraphina up and down in 3 seconds and reached conclusions that she kept entirely to herself. Mrs. Holt, you'll share the east room with Ada. Up at 5. The Duke takes breakfast at 7, sharp. You will not speak to him unless spoken to. You will not enter the East Wing library without his direct instruction. You will not, under any circumstances, touch the mahogany writing desk in the study. Those are the rules that matter. The rest, I'll tell you as we go. Seraphina. Yes, Mrs. Holt. Mrs. Holt, you have good posture. Seraphina. I'll try to do something about that. Mrs. Holt's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile would leave behind if it happened very quickly, and didn't want to be seen. She met the boys that afternoon. Leo was 12, serious-faced and watchful, with his uncle's dark hair and a habit of folding his arms across his chest when he was thinking. Simon was 10, loud, quick-moving, and currently sliding across the polished corridor floor in his stocking feet. Toby was 7, small for his age, with enormous brown eyes and a tendency to appear silently at your elbow when you least expected him. Their parents, Julian's younger brother and his wife, had died of a fever the previous winter. The boys had been at Blackwood Manor since February. They had, in that time, destroyed 3 vases, climbed onto the roof twice, and driven away 1 nanny, 1 tutor, and 1 attempt at a governess. Seraphina found Simon on top of a wardrobe. Simon, I'm not coming down. Seraphina, I didn't ask you to. He blinked. That had clearly not been the response he was prepared for. Simon, why not? Seraphina, because I'm busy, and because you'll come down when you're hungry. She went back to folding linen. After 4 minutes, Simon climbed down on his own. The first meeting, Julian Thorne. She was cleaning the grate in the Duke's study when he came in. She had been told he was not expected back until Thursday. It was Tuesday. She had ash on her hands and a streak of soot on her cheekbone, and absolutely no plan for this. She heard the door open. She heard his footsteps unhurried, deliberately crossing the room. She kept her eyes on the grate and her hands moving, because that was what a real maid would do. The footsteps stopped behind her. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Julian, you missed a spot. She turned her head. He was looking at the upper left corner of the grate with an expression of mild, distant interest, as if noting the weather through a window. Seraphina, I'll get it, sir. Julian, I know you will. He moved to his desk. She finished the grate. She collected her tools. She stood, turned, and made it almost to the door before he spoke again. Julian, Fina Wells. She stopped. Julian, Mrs. Holt tells me you arrived Monday. Seraphina, yes, sir. Julian, and that you handled Simon's wardrobe episode with admirable patience. Seraphina, he came down on his own, sir. Julian, he never comes down on his own. He was looking at her now, not the way Victoria would look at her, which was a look designed to find weakness. This was something else, something careful and precise, and oddly respectful, like a man reading a text in a language he is still learning. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, the polite limit, and then looked away. Seraphina, will there be anything else, sir? Julian, no. Thank you, Fina. She left. She walked down the corridor at an even, unhurried pace. She turned the corner. She leaned her back against the stone wall and breathed. He noticed too much. That was the danger. That was the thing she had not prepared for. Not the work, not the rules, not the cold mornings and the aching hands. The fact that this man, this silent, observant, uncomfortably perceptive man, noticed things. Blackwood Manor, week 2. The boys adopted her. There was no formal decision about this. It simply happened. The way weather happens, you look up one day, and the sky is different, and you understand that something has shifted. It started with Toby. He appeared at her elbow on a Wednesday morning, while she was polishing silver in the butler's pantry. He sat down on the floor beside her stool and watched her work in complete silence for 11 minutes. Toby, our mother used to hum when she worked. Seraphina kept polishing. Seraphina, what did she hum? Toby, I don't remember exactly. Something with 3 notes that went up and then down. She began to hum something soft, 3 notes up and 3 notes down. She wasn't sure where it came from, possibly from her own childhood, from some nurse or kitchen maid she had barely noticed, because she was too young to understand that people who worked quietly in the background of your life were the ones who held it steady. Toby leaned his small head against her knee and closed his eyes. She kept polishing and humming, and did not let herself think too hard about what she was doing, because the warmth of it might have undone her entirely. Leo was harder to reach. He had built his grief into a wall, and was tending it carefully, as if he understood at 12 that the wall was the only thing keeping him together. He constantly read thick, serious books from the library, books Seraphina recognized, because she had read many of them herself. One afternoon she found him struggling with a passage in a Greek philosophical text by Aristotle, the section on practical wisdom, with a dictionary open beside him and frustration pulling at the corners of his mouth. Seraphina. He's arguing that the virtuous person doesn't just know the right thing, they feel drawn toward it. Leo looked up sharply. Leo, you read Greek? Seraphina. A little. She stopped. She had almost said, my father's library. Seraphina. Someone taught me. A long time ago. Leo watched her for a long moment. Then he pushed the book slightly in her direction. Leo, the next section is harder. Can you stay? She stayed. 2 hours. They worked through Aristotle, and then wandered into a disagreement about whether wisdom could be taught, or whether it had to be earned through suffering. And the disagreement was so genuinely interesting that Seraphina forgot, briefly, entirely, to be careful. Julian watched all of this from a distance. He was a man who had learned, early and at some cost, that the most important information arrived quietly, not announced, not performed, but simply present, if you were paying attention. He paid attention. He watched Fina Wells calm his youngest nephew with a hum she conjured from nowhere. He watched her draw his eldest nephew into a conversation about Greek philosophy, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He watched her manage Simon's endless, restless energy, with a patience that was not the dull patience of a woman with no other options. It was the patient attention of a woman who genuinely found people interesting. He told himself he was watching, because he was protective of the boys. He was not entirely honest with himself. That evening, the servants' corridor. She was carrying a tray of tea things back to the kitchen when she rounded a corner and walked directly into Julian Thorne. The tray tilted. He caught it one hand under the edge, steady, without looking away from her face. They were very close. Close enough that she could see the slight irregularity in the line of his jaw where an old scar crossed it. Close enough that he could see, if he looked, and he was looking at the silver chain at her collarbone. She stepped back. He let go of the tray. Julian. Careful. Seraphina. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't hear you coming. Julian. I walk quietly. Seraphina. I'll remember that. He nodded. He moved to step past her. Then he paused. Julian. Leo told me you helped him with Aristotle today. Seraphina. He was working hard at it already. He didn't need much help. Julian. He smiled at dinner. He hasn't done that in 3 months. She did not know what to say to that. The weight of it was too large for a corridor conversation between a duke and his maid. Julian seemed to understand this. He nodded again, a small, sincere nod, and continued down the corridor. She stood still for a moment after he was gone. This man was not what she had been afraid of. That was the most alarming thing she had discovered yet. Sam. The East Wing Library. 11:30 at night. She had not meant to linger. She had come in to return a candlestick that had been left on a side table, a simple errand, 2 minutes at most, and then she had seen the book. It was sitting open on the reading table near the window, a worn, much annotated copy of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. She had read it twice. She knew it the way you know a piece of music you love, not just the words but the rhythm of the argument, the places where it soared, and the places where it needed more from the reader than it gave. She picked it up, meaning only to look at it for a moment. An hour later, she was still there. She had found a disagreement in an annotation in the margins, in dark ink, a man's handwriting, arguing with Mill's second chapter, on a point she found genuinely interesting. She had, without quite deciding to, begun reading the annotations more carefully. They were careful, precise, and occasionally wrong in ways that were more interesting than being right. She was composing a silent rebuttal to one particularly confident annotation when the library door opened. Julian Thorne stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. She looked at the book in her hands and the complete impossibility of any reasonable explanation for why she was here at this hour, reading his personal annotations. He crossed the room slowly. He sat down in the armchair beside the reading lamp. He looked at her with an expression of calm, unhurried interest. "Julian, page 42. Seraphina. Sir? Julian, the annotation you're reading. It's on page 42. You have the look of someone who disagrees with it." She should have said nothing. She should have set the book down, apologized, and left. Seraphina. He argues that individual liberty must yield to social utility in cases of direct harm, but he defines harm so narrowly that the argument loses almost all its useful force. A pause. Julian tilted his head. "Julian, that's the annotation I wrote at 24. I've since revised it." She looked up from the book. "Seraphina, what changed your mind?" "Julian, living. Watching what happens when you give institutions the power to define harm." They looked at each other across the lamplight. The fire in the grate had burned down to a quiet orange. Outside, rain had begun, the soft, steady November kind. She knew she should be careful. She knew every sentence she spoke here was a thread she was pulling from her disguise. But there was something about this room, and this rain, and this man, who argued with books in the margins, and revised his own opinions, and looked at her like she was worth arguing back, with something that made her feel very far away. "Julian, where did you study?" "Seraphina. I didn't, not formally." "Julian, then someone taught you to read like a scholar." "Seraphina. My father believed education was not a privilege to be withheld." "Julian, a wise man." "Seraphina. He was." The past tense landed between them. Julian did not press it. He reached out, and she handed him the book, because it was his, and because handing it back felt like the most honest thing she could do at that moment. He turned to a page near the back and held it out to her. "Julian, read this section. Tell me if you think the argument holds." She read it. She told him. They argued, quietly, for another hour, while the rain spoke against the windows and the fire burned down to nothing, and neither of them mentioned the fact that this was not a conversation that was supposed to be happening between a duke and his maid, because it wasn't, and they both knew it, but neither of them moved to stop it. The grand staircase, morning, day 11. She slipped on the stairs. It was stupid and mundane, and entirely avoidable. She was carrying a stack of folded curtains that blocked her sightline, and the third step from the top was slightly more worn than the others, and she had not yet learned its particular character. She went down hard. The curtains cascaded. She reached for the banister, and missed it, and then a hand closed around her arm, firm, immediate, strong, and arrested her fall so completely that she barely even jolted. She looked up. Julian. He was 2 steps below her, both hands now on her arms, steadying her. His face was very close. His expression was something between alarmed and furious, and it was directed entirely at the stairs, as if they had done this to her personally. "Julian, are you hurt?" "Seraphina, no, I'm not. I'm fine, thank you." He helped her to the landing. She gathered the curtains, and it was in that gathering, in the slightly awkward business of kneeling to collect fabric from steps, that the chain at her collar swung forward. The velvet bag that held the signet ring slipped out from beneath her neckline. Julian's hand, which had been reaching to help gather curtains, went still. He looked at the bag. Seraphina did not see him. She was focused on the curtains. She tucked the chain back, straightened, and stood. "Seraphina, thank you, sir. I'm sorry about the curtains." "Julian, don't apologize. Are you certain you aren't hurt?" "Seraphina, certain. Thank you." She gathered the curtains and left. Julian stood on the landing and did not move for a long moment. The velvet bag. The specific shape of it is small, drawstring, old. The glimpse of something metallic inside, something with a raised crest. He knew the Vance family seal. He had studied it 6 months ago at the bottom of a letter. A letter that had refused him. Julian's perspective. The study. That evening. He sat at his writing desk with a single candle and the original letter in front of him. He had kept it not out of wounded feeling, but because it had impressed him. It was the most direct, clearly argued refusal he had ever received, and he had received several, because he was a duke, and dukes received refusals that were usually dressed in so many layers of politeness that the refusal itself was nearly invisible. This one had not been invisible. Lady Seraphina Vance, to Julian Thorne, Duke of Blackwood. "I do not know you, my lord. You do not know me. I have no doubt your estate is substantial, and your character is fine enough. But I will not enter a marriage as a transaction between two men who have decided my value without consulting me. If that changes, if you are the sort of man who might find that view reasonable, rather than offensive, then perhaps we might meet properly. Until then, I remain, respectfully, unable to oblige. S. Vance." He had read it 4 times when it arrived. He had thought, she is either very foolish or very brave. He had concluded, brave. He had been thinking about how to reply to a woman like that ever since, and had not yet found the right words. And now she was in his house, pretending to be a maid, running from something, probably Harwick Stain, whose reputation had been crawling through London gossip for 2 months, whose name had been linked to the Vance family in a rumor Julian had heard and chosen not to investigate too closely, because it wasn't his business. It was his business now. She ran from one cage and walked into a house, into an entirely different life, and she didn't do it helplessly. She did it with a forged letter and a borrowed name, and her father's ring tucked against her heart. And she did it because she decided she would rather work than be sold. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He was not going to tell her he knew. Not yet. Not like this. She had written to him 6 months ago, with extraordinary honesty, "I will not be a transaction." And the only way to honor that, the only way to be the kind of man that letter deserved, was to let her choose him freely. To let her see him clearly, without the weight of his title pressing down on every interaction. She was already beginning to see him, he thought. In the library, the night before, she had argued with him as an equal. She had disagreed clearly and without apology. She had made him think. He would wait. He would protect her, as he already was, from Victoria's suspicion and Harwick Stein's search parties. He would not push. He would simply be present and honest and available. And he would let Lady Seraphina Vance, who was also Fina Wells, who had more courage in one silver chain than most people had in their entire lives, decide for herself. Blackwood Manor, Week 3, the arrival. He arrived on a grey Thursday in a black carriage with his crest painted on the door, a rearing stag over the motto, "By right of strength," which told you everything you needed to know about Harwick Stain, Marquis of Dunmore. He was 51 years old and carried himself like a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. He had the particular loudness of a man who had never once been told to lower his voice. He had cold, flat eyes that assessed everything in terms of ownership. He was in the entrance hall for 40 seconds before he began complaining. Seraphina heard him from the servants' corridor before she saw him. She stopped moving. Every instinct in her body went very quiet, the way animals go quiet before a storm. She pressed herself against the wall of the corridor and did not breathe. "Stane, Duke Thorne, my thanks for the invitation. I trust the hunting is as good as promised. I have a matter or two to resolve in this part of the country while I'm here. Julian, the pheasant season has been excellent. Welcome to Blackwood." She heard Julian's voice smooth, entirely unhurried, and she heard, beneath the courtesy, the precision of a man who had chosen his words in advance. Not the warmth he used with the boys, not the openness she had heard in the library. Something else. A performance, carefully done. Then she heard the next voice. "Victoria, Lord Stane, how delightful. I believe you mentioned in your last letter that you had business in Northumberland." Victoria had invited Stane. Victoria had found something, a name, a connection, a rumor, and had used it. The rage that moved through Seraphina was clean and cold, and very useful. She used it to make herself think. She had three options. She could leave tonight, quietly, and start again somewhere else. She could stay and be caught, or she could trust the one person in this house who had, so far, given her no reason not to. She thought about the library, about Aristotle, about the way he had caught her on the stairs. She went back to work. Then, the hunting party that afternoon, Julian orchestrated it precisely. He took Stane on the full estate tour, 3 hours of walking, 2 hours of shooting, one long dinner with enough fine wine that the Marquis was thoroughly occupied and thoroughly satisfied. In the moments between, Julian sent Toby to find Fina and tell her to work exclusively in the East Wing for the next 3 days. He arranged for her meals to be brought there. He rerouted Stane's guest suite to the West Wing, as far from the servants' east quarters as the house allowed. He did all of this without speaking to her about it. He was not ready to speak to her about it yet, because speaking to her about it would require admitting what he knew, and he was not ready to have that conversation in the middle of a crisis. But in the evening, when the house was quiet, and Stein was asleep behind his locked guest wing door, Julian found a reason to walk past the East Wing study, where Seraphina was working late. He paused in the doorway. "Julian, you're working late." "Seraphina, the inventory in here needed updating." "Julian, it did. Thank you." A pause. "Julian, Stane leaves Sunday. He has no business in the East Wing." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ledger open on the table, but she heard the thing underneath the sentence. "Seraphina, I understand. Thank you, sir." He nodded once and left. He was protecting her. She was not imagining it, and she did not know what to do with that, with the feeling it left the strange, alarming warmth of being seen and shielded by someone who owed her absolutely nothing. The study day. 19. Afternoon. Victoria had spent 2 weeks building her case. She was nothing if not patient. The kind of patient that comes not from peace, but from a quiet, sustained appetite for winning. She had gone through 3 weeks of household account ledgers. She had found what she needed, a set of corrections made in a hand that was not the steward's, in a style that was too educated, too precise, too assured. The kind of corrections that came from a woman who had grown up watching estate managers work. She had also found, in a servant's room that should have contained nothing more personal than a Bible and a change of dress, a small leather journal. Its first page read, "SV Private." She said nothing. She waited. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, she arranged for herself to be in the study at the same time as Fina, with the Duke's household steward present as a witness. Seraphina walked in to dust the upper shelves and found Victoria waiting. The 3 boys were there too. Leo had brought Toby to see the paintings, and Simon had followed, and they stood near the door in a cluster, not understanding precisely what was happening, but understanding perfectly that it was something to be worried about. Victoria placed the journal on the desk. Victoria, SV. Those are not the initials of a maid named Fina Wells. The silence in the room was very complete. Seraphina looked at the journal. She looked at Victoria. She calculated, in the space of 2 seconds, every possible response, every lie, every redirect, and understood that none of them would work. Victoria had been building this moment for weeks. Julian entered. He never ran, but he had been moving quickly. She could tell from the way his coat settled as he came to a stop. He had been warned, or he had heard, or he simply had an instinct for rooms that needed him. He saw Victoria. He saw Seraphina. He saw the journal on the desk, and the boys near the door with their wide, serious eyes. He walked to the desk. He stood behind Seraphina's chair. The gesture was exact and deliberate. He placed himself between her and the threat, and he did it without touching her, without drama, without raising his voice. Julian, Lady Sterling, is there something you'd like to discuss? Victoria, this woman is not who she says she is. I found her private journal, her initials. Julian, RSV, for Sophia Villiers, who is my maid's maternal grandmother, after whom she was named, and after whom she has kept this journal since childhood. As she told me when I discovered it in the library 3 weeks ago, where she had accidentally left it. Victoria's composure held for 3 seconds. Then something behind her eyes shifted. Victoria, you're lying. Julian, I am a duke in my own study, Lady Sterling. I would be very careful about the next word you choose. The steward looked at the floor. The boys looked at Julian with an expression of combined worship and relief. Victoria looked at the journal, then at Julian, then at Seraphina, and in the precise way that ruthless people calculate, she understood that she had lost this round. She picked up the journal. She set it down in front of Seraphina. Victoria, my mistake. She left. The steward followed. Leo let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for 3 minutes. Simon said something under his breath that his uncle chose not to hear. Toby walked across the room and stood beside Seraphina's chair, so close that his shoulder pressed against her arm. Julian looked down at her. She was looking up at him. There were no words appropriate to this moment. There was only the fact of what he had just done, the public, certain, unambiguous fact of it. Julian, I apologize for the disruption to your work. He said it perfectly straight. There was not quite a smile in it, but there was something of a warmth at the edges of the sentence that was for her alone. Seraphina, thank you, sir. After he left, Seraphina sat very still for a long moment, with Toby's shoulder warm against her arm and her father's ring pressing against her breastbone, and she thought, he made up a story. He lied to protect me. He did it without being asked, without any warning, without any hesitation at all. The grand ballroom, night before the winter ball. The ballroom was being dressed for tomorrow's festivities. It smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers, white roses and winter greenery banked along the walls, crystal garlands already hung from the chandeliers above. The decorators had finished their work 2 hours ago, and the room had been left to itself, lit only by a row of candles along the mantelpiece that someone had forgotten to extinguish. Seraphina should not have been there. She had come to check on the flower arrangements Mrs. Holt had asked her, to verify the roses were fresh, and then she had simply stayed. She stood at the edge of the room in the shadows of the doorway, looking in at the light and the empty floor, and the chairs arranged along the walls in rows of white and gold. She had grown up in rooms like this. She had worn gowns in rooms like this, and stood at the edge of them, while her father presented her to men who looked at her like she was a parcel. She had danced in rooms like this properly, skillfully, with the fixed smile of a woman who had been trained to perform grace on demand. She had never simply stood in one and looked at it and wanted it. Wanting felt dangerous. Wanting meant something was at stake. Tomorrow, Stain would be at the ball. Tomorrow, Victoria will be watching. Tomorrow, the season's guests would fill this room with all of London society packed into Blackwood Manor, and one wrong gesture, one recognition, one person with a long enough memory and a sharp enough eye would end everything. She should go to bed. She should be rested and invisible and ready for tomorrow. She stayed. Julian found her there 20 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway on the opposite side of the ballroom. He saw her standing in the shadows with her arms crossed loosely over herself, looking at the empty dance floor with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the careful, controlled pleasantness she wore in the corridors, not the focused intensity she wore over books. Something quieter and more private longing, maybe, or grief, or both. He crossed the room toward her. She heard him and turned, and for one unguarded second, he saw exactly what she had been thinking about. Then the mask came back, gentle, professional, contained. Julian, the roses look fine. Seraphina, they do. They'll last through tomorrow. Julian, good. He stood beside her, looking out at the ballroom. A pause. Julian, do you waltz? The question landed quietly. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the empty floor. Seraphina, I haven't. In some time. Julian, neither have I. He turned to face her and offered his hand. It was a simple gesture, not a performance, not a demand. Just a hand, open, in the direction of a woman he had been watching, choose courage over and over for 3 weeks. She looked at it for a long moment. She took it. He was a good dancer. She had not expected that. Or perhaps she had moved through rooms the way good dancers moved through music, with a settled authority that made the whole thing feel effortless. He held her at the correct distance. He led without pulling. His hand on her back was steady and warm. They danced in the empty ballroom, no music but the slight percussion of their footsteps on the polished floor, and the candles burned along the mantelpiece, and outside the November night pressed cold against the long windows. After a minute, he said quietly, Julian, you dance like someone who was taught by someone who loved it. Seraphina, my father. He said it was the most honest conversation two people could have without speaking. Julian considered this. Julian, I think he was right. They kept dancing. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the careful silence of two people maintaining a performance. It was the silence of two people who were, in this particular moment, being entirely honest. When they stopped, they were standing slightly closer than they had started. His hand had not moved. Hers had not moved. She looked up at him. She thought, I know what this is. And she thought, I am not ready. And she thought, I have been running for 3 weeks, and I am tired of running. And then she thought nothing at all, because he was looking at her with an expression she had no defense for. It was not desire, or not only desire, it was recognition, the expression of a man looking at something he has been looking for, possibly for a very long time. She stepped back. She did it gently. Seraphina, I should... Julian. Yes, Seraphina. Good night, sir. Julian. Good night. She walked away. She did not look back. He stood in the empty ballroom until the last candle burned out. Spalls. The winter ball. Blackwood Manor. The following evening. The house was full. Every room on the ground floor had been opened. The chandeliers blazed. Music from a string quartet moved through the corridors like something alive. Ladies in gowns of ice blue and deep crimson moved between clusters of men in black tailcoats, and the whole brilliant assembly glittered and talked and turned and sparkled with the specific ferocity of people who had spent months waiting for a room like this one. Seraphina worked the edges of it, refilling glasses, directing footmen, carrying messages between Mrs. Holt and the kitchen. She kept her face down and her movements quick. She had done everything right today. She had stayed in the east wing all morning. She had worn a cap pulled low. She had avoided the main corridors until the guests were all inside and the entrances were closed. She thought she was safe. She was not. Victoria had not given up. Victoria had simply waited for the moment with the most witnesses. It happened near the doorway to the main ballroom, at the point in the evening when the guests had gathered for the dancing to begin. Seraphina was carrying a tray of champagne. Victoria appeared in front of her, as if she had materialized from the wallpaper. "Victoria, I should have recognized you immediately. I danced with you at the Ashbourne Ball 4 years ago. You were wearing cream silk. Lady Seraphina Vance." She said it loudly, clearly, with the deliberate projection of a woman who had rehearsed exactly how loud she needed to be. Heads turned. The nearest cluster of guests was 12 people. 15 went still. The tray went down. A footman caught it. Seraphina straightened and looked at Victoria with a steadiness that cost her considerably more than it appeared to. From the far side of the room, Stain turned. He crossed toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man who believed every room eventually arranged itself for his benefit. "Stain, Lady Seraphina, what a remarkable coincidence. Your guardian has been very concerned." Seraphina, "Lord Stain, you will come with me. Tonight, we have a contract to complete." Seraphina, "I will not." Stain, "You haven't a choice, my dear. You are legally..." Seraphina, "I am not your dear, and I am not legally anything to you. I never signed that contract. My guardian did, and I am not my guardian's property." The guests nearest them had stopped pretending not to listen. The music had faltered. The quiet spread outward through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Stain's face had gone the dark red of a man whose patience had a very short and well-defined edge. "Stain, you fraudulent little..." Julian, Lord Stain. He was there. He had been moving from the moment Victoria spoke, crossing the room with that calm, decisive stride, arriving like the answer to a question no one had finished asking. He stood between Stain and Seraphina. He did not touch either of them. He did not raise his voice. He had not needed to raise his voice in some years. "Julian, I believe you were speaking to my betrothed." The silence was absolute. Stain blinked. "Stain, I beg your pardon." Julian reached into the breast pocket of his coat and removed a folded document. He held it out, not to Stain, not to Victoria, but to the room, to everyone. "Julian, the formal arranged marriage contract between the House of Thorn and the House of Vance, drawn up 4 years ago by our respective fathers, signed, witnessed, legally binding. Lady Seraphina Vance is the contracted future Duchess of Blackwood." He turned to look at Seraphina. She was looking at the document. She was remembering the letter she had written 6 months ago. "I will not enter a marriage as a transaction between 2 men who have decided my value without consulting me." And she was remembering what she had not known then, that the man on the other side of that letter had read it 4 times and agreed with her. He was not looking at her as a possession to be claimed or a problem to be solved. He was looking at her and waiting. "Julian, no one is required to honor a contract they didn't personally choose. I want to make that absolutely clear." He said it to the room. He said it to Stain. But his eyes were on her. "Julian, the contract gives me the legal right to stand here and remove Lord Stain from any claim. What I do not have, that I have never had, is the right to tell you who you are, or what you choose. That has always been yours." The room breathed. Stein looked between them with the slow, dawning recognition of a man watching the ground shift under him. "Stein, Julian, this is a private family matter, Lord Stein, to which you are not party. I believe your carriage can be made ready within the hour." It was not a question. Stain knew what a duke in his own house sounded like. He knew when a room had shifted and when a battle was already lost. He straightened his coat, looked at Seraphina with a cold, retreating fury, and turned away. Victoria had gone very still. Her face held the particular blankness of a woman revising everything she thought she had understood. Julian looked at Seraphina. The room was very quiet. The music had not resumed. 47 people were trying not to appear to be watching and failing comprehensively. "Julian, you don't have to decide anything tonight. You don't have to decide anything at all if you don't want to." "Seraphina, you knew. You've known for some time." Julian. 11 days. Seraphina. And you said nothing. You had a reason for being here. I didn't want to take that from you. She looked at him for a long moment. All the noise of the room, the guests, the music beginning again at the far end, the rustle and murmur of a party finding its feet again, all of it was at a great distance. Seraphina, I wrote you a letter 6 months ago. Julian. I know. Seraphina, I told you I wouldn't be a transaction. Julian. And you were right. You still are. Another moment. She stepped forward deliberately, with full awareness of every eye in the room, and she took the contract from his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. She folded it carefully and held it against her chest, where her father's ring was. Seraphina, we'll talk about this properly, not here. Julian. Agreed. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back into the ballroom together, and the string quartet, with excellent social instinct, struck up a waltz. The house was quiet again. The guests had retired or departed. The last carriages had crunched away down the gravel drive. Mrs. Holt had organized the clearing up with her usual brisk efficiency and sent the staff to bed. The chandeliers had been dimmed. Seraphina was in the library. She had changed out of the blue gown she had borrowed from a guest room at Julian's quiet instruction, and she would need to explain that to someone eventually, and was back in her grey dress. She had taken down her hair. She sat at the reading table with the contract in front of her and her father's ring, finally out of its velvet bag, on the table beside it. Julian came in 20 minutes after her. He had removed his tailcoat. He carried 2 cups of tea, which he set down with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who understands that conversations like this one go better with something warm to hold. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other. Seraphina, tell me everything. From the beginning. Julian. The contract was drawn by our fathers when you were 16, and I was 22. Your father wanted the alliance. Mine agreed. No one asked either of us. Seraphina. And when my father died, and my uncle took over. Julian. The contract remained legally valid, but I had no intention of enforcing it. I had written to your uncle asking to be formally introduced, because I thought if I was going to marry anyone, I ought to at least have met them. Seraphina. And then my letter arrived. 38. Julian. And then your letter arrived. She looked at the contract. She looked at the ring. Seraphina. You kept it. The letter. Julian. I found it interesting. It was the most honest communication I had received in about 4 years. Seraphina. I called you a transaction. Julian. You called the arrangement a transaction. You were remarkably careful not to insult me personally, given that you'd never met me. Seraphina. I thought about it. I decided it wasn't fair to condemn a man I'd never seen. He almost smiled. Julian. And now you've seen me. She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 3 weeks in corridors and studies and libraries and a candlelit ballroom with no music, and she knew what she saw. A man who was careful with words and generous with silence. A man who had gone 3 children quiet again and left the door open for someone he owed nothing to, and stood between her and danger twice, and once made up a story about a grandmother named Sophia Villiers without blinking. A man who had read her letter 4 times and understood it. Seraphina. I am not going to be a transaction. Julian. No. Seraphina. If I choose to honor this contract, and I said, if it will not be because of our fathers or your title, or because I have no other options. I have other options. I have 3 weeks of other options. Julian. I know. Seraphina. I want you to know that I see the difference between what you did tonight and what Stain would have done. You named me, and then you told the entire room I wasn't required to choose you. Julian. That's the truth. Seraphina. I know. That's what I'm telling you. A long silence. The fire spoke softly. Rain had returned, the same steady November rain that had been there during their first night of conversation, as if the weather had an opinion about symmetry. She picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers. The crest of House Vance caught the firelight. A simple design, A single star over an open book. Her father's design. A man who believed in education and love and the radical idea that his daughter's life belonged to his daughter. She put it on. The right hand. Her own choice. Seraphina. I am Lady Seraphina Vance. Not Fina Wells. Not a maid. Not a transaction. Julian. I know who you are. Seraphina. Then let's start from there. 1 month later. Blackwood Manor. The formal betrothal announcement appeared in the London papers on the 30th of November. It was short and exact, the way Julian Thorne did most things. Julian Thorne, Duke of Blackwood, and Lady Seraphina Vance of Vance Estate are pleased to announce their formal engagement, contracted by mutual and individual consent. That last part, mutual and individual consent, was not standard language for an engagement announcement. Julian had insisted on it. The editor of the paper had asked whether he was certain. Julian had said that he was. The 3 boys received the news in the breakfast room. Leo said, I knew. He said it with the dignified composure of a 12-year-old who was also, clearly, very pleased. Simon said, does this mean Fina isn't leaving? And when Seraphina said it meant exactly that, he performed a celebration that involved 3 spins, 1 leap onto the armchair, and a noise that startled the dog. Toby said nothing. He simply walked to where Seraphina was sitting, climbed up beside her, and tucked himself against her arm. She pulled him close. She thought of his mother, a woman she had never met, who had hummed something with 3 notes that went up and then down. She thought, I will learn that song. I will hum it until he remembers it. That is something I can do. Harwick Stane departed Northumberland on the morning following the ball. Julian's solicitor sent a formal legal letter 3 days later, making clear that any attempt to pursue the Vance family arrangement would be met with the full weight of the Thorne legal team, and, if necessary, a petition to the Crown. Stane did not reply. Lady Victoria Sterling left Blackwood Manor the morning after the ball. She sent a note that said, simply, my congratulations to the Duke. She did not mention Seraphina. Seraphina did not mention her. There were, after that, no more enemies in the house. There were only a man and a woman, learning the specific and imprecise art of building something genuine, and 3 boys who had decided they were staying, and a dog who had opinions about the armchair, and a library full of books with arguments in the margins, and a ballroom where no one had yet put up the Christmas decorations. Seraphina put them up herself, on a Saturday morning, while Julian read on the settee, and the boys argued over the placement of the star. She climbed the stepladder and hung the last piece of greenery above the door, and looked down at the room full of noise and light, and the 3 small faces of people who had quietly, without announcement, become hers. She thought of the woman she had been 6 weeks ago, standing at a servant's door with a forged letter and a borrowed name, running from a life that had tried to fold her up. She thought, I ran in the right direction. I just didn't know it yet. Julian, careful on that ladder. Seraphina, you always say that. Julian, you always make it necessary. She climbed down. He was standing at the bottom of the ladder, not reaching up, not hovering, just present, exactly as he always was, present and steady, and looking at her with that expression that had undone her from the beginning. She stepped off the last rung. Seraphina, you know, you could have introduced yourself. 6 months ago, you could have written back. Julian, I didn't know what to say to a woman who was entirely right. Seraphina, and now? Julian, I still don't, but I find I don't mind not knowing. When it's you I'm not knowing it with. She laughed. She had not expected it to surprise her, the way real laughter always does, arriving without permission. He smiled. A real one, the kind she had learned to look for, that lived mostly at the corners. Simon knocked the stepladder over. Toby blamed Leo. Leo denied it with considerable dignity. Julian caught the garland that fell from the top. Seraphina looked at all of it, the chaos and the noise and the man holding a strand of winter greenery, with perfect seriousness, and she was so purely happy that she stood very still, The way you stand still when something is exactly right, because you don't want to disturb it. There is an old idea, comfortable and wrong, that the brave thing is the expected thing. That staying in a bad situation because it is familiar is somehow safer than walking out into the unknown. Seraphina Vance knew that was a lie. She had lived inside that lie long enough to smell it. The brave thing is not always the comfortable thing. Sometimes it is waking up on the wrong side of everything you were told you should want, and choosing anyway. Sometimes it is forging a letter and walking into a strange house and learning to scrub floors and trusting a man you have no logical reason to trust, because your own judgment, that inconvenient, unreasonable, too sharp for a drawing room judgment, tells you he is worth trusting. And sometimes the life you were running toward was the one you were running to all along. You just needed to run far enough to arrive. Julian Thorne knew something different. The lesson that comes to people who have status and power, and the temptation to use it. He had learned that the greatest thing you can offer someone is not your protection, not your title, not your intervention in their crisis. It is the freedom to choose. It is the space to be known, rather than claimed. He waited. He let her come to herself. He held the door open and stepped back from it. And that, more than anything else, was the act that made him worth choosing. There are people who will try to own you. There are people who will try to find you in the worst moment of your life and use that moment to bind you to them. And then there are people rarer, quieter, worth finding, who will stand behind your chair and make up a story about a grandmother named Sophia, just to give you one more day of freedom. Earn the first, see through the second, hold on to the third with both hands. How subscribe to see how this unfolds. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.